In this episode of War in Ukraine, History in the Making, I have an important message for the world community. Pretty much everyone wants this war to end as soon as possible because, like all wars, it is a devastating situation, and also for Ukraine's sovereignty and integrity to be protected. Therefore, the wealthiest liberal democracies are doing whatever they can to support Ukraine in its fight against Russia, while the international community vigorously pursues peace talks in order to bring about a negotiated settlement. However, whatever the end game is, we all have to keep the future in mind. Can peace and stability be ensured after the end of the war? When it comes to how a war ends and what impact it leaves behind, one crucial factor is whether or not the status quo continues. If you want a war to end in a resolute manner, to be resolved, you have to make sure that when it ends, things do not go back to the way they were before the war began, because those circumstances were what brought about the war in the first place. Another version of this is that a war should not end in a tie, or with both sides having gained a hold on power. Otherwise, the potential is created for a repeat war or a similar war in the future, or just a lot of tensions and trouble down the line. The Allied powers of World War II took this principle very seriously. That's why they demanded unconditional surrender. They knew it was not enough to just kick the Germans and Japanese out of the territories they invaded. Their governments would have to be deposed and they be occupied and reformed. Otherwise, fascism would continue to be a threat. After that war, few seem to ever keep this principle in mind again, but continue to prove itself time and time again. Take the example of Korea, divided between a communist North and capitalist South in 1950. The North invaded the South, and then America got involved and tried to destroy the communists, and then China got involved and tried to destroy the capitalists, and there was a stalemate, and then the war ended with a ceasefire in which Korea went back to the same North-South division. And that has led to Korea being an extremely hostile armed camp ever since then that is now disturbing the peace of the world. And what about the first Indochina War, an uprising by the Viet Minh against French rule? It ended with a compromise agreement at the Geneva Accords in which Vietnam would be partitioned between a communist North and a capitalist pro-Western South. And that, of course, led to a decades-long war that wreaked unimaginable devastation on all of Indochina. And an example that is close to my country, Pakistan, in 1947, when India and Pakistan went to war with each other over who gets to control Kashmir, the UN, after some time, brokered a ceasefire that divided Kashmir between the two countries. That led to the 1965 war over Kashmir, which ended with the Tashkent Agreement, which required the belligerent parties to go back to the position they were before the war. And what that has brought us now is that Kashmir is now a nuclear flashpoint and an endless source of trouble for South Asia. So history shows time and time again that it is a very bad idea for a war to end in such ways. If you want to secure a lasting peace and stability, then either you bring about an agreement that can be relied upon in the long term, or you fight, or you let the war be fought to the finish, however hard that may be to swallow. Otherwise, there could be potential for an even worse war in the future. This lesson we have to keep in mind regarding the war currently raging in Europe. But how can one implement it? Well, some may be trying to do that. Recall my last episode in which I discussed Ukraine's possible endgame. I said that Ukraine might fight to expel Russian troops from not only the Donbass but also Crimea, because the Russian presence in those areas is how the war came about in the first place. This view seems to have been expressed by the British Foreign Secretary Liz Truss recently, when she said that the West's aims should be for all Russian troops to be completely expelled from all of Ukraine, and Crimea is still recognized by the international community as belonging to Ukraine. As for Russia, there are clear signs that they're being guided by this principle that I've outlined. It could be that Russia's original intentions were just to take the territory in southeastern Ukraine, or even just the Donbass, but they knew that if they achieved this, what would be left of Ukraine would continue to be hostile and angry, and that could create a lot of troubles, a lot of problems down the line. And that must be why Russia spent the first month of the war advancing on Kiev with the apparent goal of overthrowing the government of Ukraine. So some people are likely fighting for a stable future. But in all likelihood, what future will this war leave behind? I think, unfortunately, that whether Ukraine or Russia prevails in the war, it will leave behind a much more unstable and hostile Europe, because I see only two stabilizing outcomes to the war. Either Ukraine's government falling and the country getting into the Russian orbit, which like Russia originally aimed to do, or Putin's government falling, which many people believe will result from the fallout of the war. But neither outcomes are likely. Russia failed in its Kiev offensive, it gave up, and Putin's Russia today is nothing like the Russia of Gorbachev or Tsar Nicholas II. I believe that Putin's hold on power will be quite secure for the foreseeable future. Also, even if a pro-Russian government was imposed on Ukraine, things likely still would not settle down. The people of Ukraine would continue to be very angry with Russia after all they've been through, and the West and Europe would be upset with this new Russian bloc that was created by force. That leaves Putin's downfall as the only favorable result, and that's the crux of the matter. There is always the one most stabilizing path that you have to look for. The modern world relies upon stability. All its currents push in the direction. Going back to the example of Kashmir, there's long been a lot of unrest in Indian occupied Kashmir, but not over in the Pakistani side. That means that it is only a Pakistani victory in the Kashmir dispute that will bring about a lasting peace for the region. This principle must be what drove Biden to say of Putin back in March, "For God's sake, this man cannot be allowed to remain in power." Many people thought this is just a rash statement that he blurted out, but it's actually a very reasonable line of thinking if your goal is to bring this entire chapter to an end once and for all. However, even if Putin fell from power, that still may not completely close the chapter. It is Russia's struggles after the collapse of the USSR that turned it towards Putinism. With Putin gone, those troubles might return, or problems of other sorts might emerge. Bottom line is that Putin is not the entire what's wrong with my throat? With Putin gone, these problems may return or other problems emerge. The bottom line is that Putin is not the entire cause of Russia being such a troubled country today. And that brings me to another point. When it comes to pursuing peace and stability, sometimes you have to dive in deep and tackle the most deep-seated factors that drive or enable a conflict. In cases like that of Russia, this will require an immense concerted effort on the part of the international community. The fact is, identifying the most stabilizing path forward for the Ukraine war, let alone implementing it, will be an immense challenge. But as Russia and Ukraine fight for their own particular cause, this will have to be the utmost priority for the international community. And it is a responsibility they must not mess up, creating an even worse future along the way, like they have done many times before. The international community has to constructively involve itself with Russia and work towards resolving its problems and concerns that drive it to resort to military action. Otherwise, Europe may be headed for nuclear war, now or sometimes in the future.